Hi folks, this is Al with BaumBuilds.com, here with an instructional video for the BDT, the Bolt-together Drift Trike that you put together yourself. This video is just one in a series of instructional videos intended to be used in combination with the Drift Trike build plans available through BaumBuilds.com and on eBay, username Auto Beverage. Beware of imitations by only from the inventor, that's me. This particular video will cover drawing 300, which is the main assembly. Now, if you're watching this video, you would have put together all the other sub-assemblies and you're ready to put the trike together in its final form. We're already in the workshop, so let's get started. And here we have our clean work area for drawing 300, the main assembly. These are the parts necessary for just step one. Parts, hardware, and tools necessary for step one only. This is a 6-step process to assemble the trike in its final form. And these are the pieces for step one. Let's take a look at the main assembly, drawing 300. As I mentioned, this is a 6-step process. So we have 6 different sheets, one for each step in the process. Taking a look at the first sheet, we are going to install the rear axle components. So our drawing, as usual, has a bill of material in the lower right hand corner, assembly notes in the upper left hand corner, and we have a partial exploded view here, a section view through the axle here, and we're going to refer to this drawing as we put our parts together. Let's take a look at the tools necessary for step one. We have a 5/16, 1/4 inch, 5/32, and 1/8 Allen key. We have a 3/4 inch socket, a 7/16 socket, a ratchet, and extension. We'll need this extension to get down into the deep dish wheel, and a large crescent wrench. Let's take a look at the hardware needed for this first step of assembly drawing 300. We have our appropriate hardware laid out in the counted quantities pulled from the bag. Let's take a look at the parts as well. We have the frame assembly that we put together in drawing 301, the wheels, drawing 303, sprocket assembly, which I believe was drawing 302. And looking at the rest of the parts, these are going to be purchased, and all the information necessary where to purchase these parts will be in the build plans. Let's take a look at the bearings, the pillow block bearings. As I mentioned before, I'm going with a blackout axle theme. You don't have to do that. I just think it'll be a nice look for this one. If you choose to go with a colored axle theme, then you'll paint your pillow block bearings accordingly. In my case, they're black. When they come, they will be a machine gray color. Of course, the sprocket is painted to match. The wheel hubs are painted to match. These will come as just a machined aluminum color. Something else to note with these, this hardware, this bolt and nut will be included with this piece. You just need to thread it in from the back side, just as I've done here. Here's your collars, again painted black. Here's the axle. Now I just painted the very middle section, and you'll note that I measured the halfway point. The reason being is when we go to slip this axle through this hole in the frame, that'll help me center the axle so there's an even distance sticking out from both ends of the vehicle. So I had to paint the middle section because that area will be inside this tube and I won't be able to get to it later. If you're not painting, then obviously you don't have to do that. Let's take a look at the chain. You'll have to cut this to length later. Of course, there's a master link and then a half link if needed, and we'll cover that later as well. Let's take a look at the keys, the shaft keys. There's a quantity of 3 in your bill of material, but you'll see in the drawing notes that you'll need to shorten one. And the reason being is one of these goes in your sprocket assembly. The other 2 will go in your wheel hubs, so the length is fine. But with the sprocket assembly, these collars will go one on both sides of this, so your key cannot stick out beyond the width of the hub. So you'll measure your hub width from here to the other surface, and you'll cut your key to that length because we don't want the key sticking out. We want this collar to bear directly against that face on that side and directly against this face on this side. Now you can use a hacksaw to cut this, or a cut-off wheel, or whatever means that you may have. So that's it for the parts and the hardware, the drawing, and the tools. So let's get started with step one. We're going to start by taking the axle, which is item 8, and sliding it through the slot in our frame. Now you'll note that I put a rag in here, and that's just to keep this paint from being scratched up and keep the axle from being scratched up. You want your axle to be completely burr-free. In other words, you can't have any little sharp edges here, because the close-fitting components like the sprocket hub and the bearing and everything won't slide over. So you should probably check all your components by sliding them on ahead of time. Remember the mark that we put here in the middle of the axle. Again, that's just to help center it in the frame. So I'm just going to slide that right in there. And just by eye and looking straight in the end here, I'm going to be able to determine that this is centered. Another way to do it is reference the length that sticks out on each end. And if you'd like, you can do that with a tape measure and just shift it back and forth until that's in the right spot. And next we want to just start sliding components on. Now we want to refer to the drawing because we want to make sure that all components on this side of the frame get put on, and all components on that side of the frame get put on before the bearings are slid on, because once the bearings are slid on, it'll be fastened to the frame, and then we won't be able to slide any of the components past that. So just take a look at the partial exploded view and the section view and start sliding your components on. Now one thing to note is the orientation of the components, and we talked about this on some of the other drawings and assemblies that we put together. This bearing has a collar that sticks out on one side where the set screws are. Note that in the drawing that collar is on the outside, so you want to make sure that that's oriented correctly. Same thing with the sprocket assembly. You have a hub on one side that sticks out and nothing that sticks out on the other side, so you want to make sure that you have that oriented correctly, and you want to make sure that you slide the components on in the right order. Now you can remove them as you need to up until the point where you put the bearings in place, and then after that you'll have to remove the bearings. So I'm going to start by sliding all the components on the left hand side of the frame onto the axle, and then I'll be back. Okay, now I have all the left hand side components on the shaft, and they're all just slid on there in the right order and the right orientation of flanges. Nothing is tight yet, everything's loose. Now note that I had to pull this shaft back out a little bit to let the sprocket clear this angle here. So we'll just push it back into the center, and we'll center that up as we go. Before we tighten everything down, we'll center up the axle. Okay, so all parts are on there, they're loose, they're movable, and not locked down. Something you might want to add to the tool list is a rubber mallet. It can help with some of just getting some of the components moving along the shaft. So we're going to move on and put the components on the right hand side. They'll go on just like the section view shows you. It's basically a mirror image of this side, less the sprocket assembly and the two collars. So I'll do all that and I'll be back. And the axle components on the right hand of the shaft were put on same way, just slid into place, nothing tight yet. Be sure to get your keys in there. There's a key on each wheel hub. Note also that we're not putting the wheels on just yet. We'll get to that later. So the next step we want to do is we want to take our hardware and we want to get these bearings put in place. Remember, there's a slot in your bearing housing, so you'll need a washer over your nut. So let's just get these into place. So 3 more of those to go, which I'll do off camera, and we'll be right back. So we've tightened up our hardware, items 4, 5, and 6, on both sides of the bearing, both bearings. So one thing to note, I kept this surface flush. The top surface of the bearing is flush with the top of this bracket. Now this bracket is the exact same length as the bearing, so you should be flush on both ends. That'll help give it a good look and keep the bearing and the axle in perfect alignment. Then you fully tighten these 4 bolts, 2 here, 2 on the other side. Now let's take a look at our axle. Looking straight down in the middle, you can see the paint mark right there where I have this centered in place. At this point, if it's not centered, just use your rubber mallet or your hand and tap it back and forth till you're centered. Of course, if you'd like, you can use a tape measure and measure out evenly on both ends. So once your axle is even in the middle, you can go ahead and use your 1/8 Allen key here and lock these collars down. Remember, there's 2 set screws per bearing. And then you're also going to slide this collar all the way over against and lock it down using your Allen key as well. So I'll take care of that and we'll be back. The next step is we're going to remove these 3 small nuts from our wheel hub here. You can leave the big axle nut on the end, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take our wheel and we're going to put that on there and line it up. So I'll do that and I'll be right back. So I've slipped the wheel over the wheel hub. Here's a view from the back side. So what I've done is I went ahead and I used my extension and my 7/16 socket, and I put the 3, let's call them lug nuts because that's basically what they are. I slid the wheel over the lugs temporarily and just snugly by hand installed the 3 lug nuts. And what that does is that pulls the wheel together with the wheel hub and makes them essentially one piece. Now remember that the wheel hub is not locked to the shaft yet. It's free to move back and forth. What we want to look at now is we want to look at this gap. We want to make sure that this wheel will spin freely. So I've left about a 1/4 inch to 3/8 gap there. And you'll want to do the same evenly from side to side. So we have the gap set where we wanted. So what I'm going to do is come in here with a Sharpie and I'm going to make a line here right where the back side of that hub ends up on the shaft. So what we're going to do now is we're going to remove the 3 lug nuts, slide the wheel back off, then we can lock our wheel hub to our shaft and then reinstall the wheel. I'm going to jump back in here momentarily just to show you a better look at this with the wheel removed. You see we have our line there and we have our hub, our Sharpie line in our hub. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make sure that the keyway is in there. And you see that it is. It's fully engaged. You want to make sure it's fully engaged, not sticking out, especially on this end, because the wheel has to rest against this surface, right? This nut has to rest against this surface. So the key cannot stick out on this side. If the key is a little long, it can stick out on this side. Okay? So with our wheel hub lined up with our Sharpie mark, we can go ahead and take our 1/4 inch Allen key and lock that fast. After that, we can take our large adjustable wrench, or if you have a socket big enough, and then run this lock nut right down on this bearing. Do that for both sides, and then reinstall the wheel with the 3 lug nuts, firmly tighten them, and that'll do it. And with both of the rear wheels on, that about does it for assembly step 1. Just want to note a couple things. We have still not locked this position down. It's free to slide along this axle. That will happen in one of the later assembly steps that are coming right up. You'll note that I did paint over to a certain extent, but not in the area where we're going to be making adjustments, so that I completed my blackout theme. Same thing on this side, painted all the way up to here. And I just masked that off by using some cardboard, but I wanted to get all the way up to here on this side because the engine, once we put it on, it'll be a little bit more difficult to get in there. So one final note, when you go to tighten the axle nuts, of course the axle is going to try to spin on you, so you can always just use the old screwdriver method. Get it pried up in there to lock that in place as you tighten the axle nut. So that does it for step 1. So let's move on to assembly step 2. And here is our clean work area for drawing 300 step 2. We have our hardware, our components, our tools, and our drawing. And here is sheet 2 of drawing 300, which is step 2, with our typical various views, including an exploded view and some detail views. In the lower right hand corner, as always, is our bill of material. In the upper left hand corner, our drawing notes. Let's take a look at the tools necessary for this step. We have a 1/8, a 3/16, and a 5/16 Allen key. We have a 3/4 socket and a ratchet. Now let's take a look at the components necessary. Here's our frame assembly with the rear axle installed from step 1. And we have our front fork assembly with bearings, which you put together in assembly 307. And also our hardware, in this case just 3 pieces, all 1/2-inch hardware, bolts, nuts, and washers. My wife makes the best bacon, doesn't she? Oh, we're rolling. Oh, now here we are at step 2, where we're going to assemble the front fork with bearing. This is drawing 307. You had already put this together. Recall from that assembly that we have the bottom bearing set screws tight and all the remaining hardware is loose. So we're going to take and we're going to assemble this right to our bearing mounting angles here, starting with the lower bearing first. So I'm going to take our 1/2-inch bolts with a washer and loosely bolt those in place, and we'll be back. Okay, we installed our 1/2-inch hardware in the lower and upper bearing. Now note that the button head goes on this side because this is the side you're going to see. In a future step there's going to be a cover plate over this, so we'll use that cover plate to cover these. So in this case the washer goes on the back side anywhere there's a slot. So there's a slot in the bearing housing, washer, then nut. So I have all 4 of these snug down, not completely tight but snug. The next thing we want to do is check and make sure that the orientation of our wheel is correct. You want the brake caliper and the disc to be on the left hand side of the vehicle. Now it is possible to do it like that. Now you'll see that the tire will hit over here, so you'll see something's not quite right. So spin it around, and our next step is you're going to want to get up in a high position here, and what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to center this lobe. You'll see there's 2 angles on this thing, and what's going to happen is those angles, when you go left and right, are going to be a steering wheel end travel stop. So this surface here will bear against that surface in both directions. So what we want to do is we want to get the wheel centered just like that, and then we want to get our steering stop lobe assembly centered. And then what we'll do is we'll come in here and we'll make a mark right between the shaft and the stop lobe, and then we'll need to remove this bearing again. Recall these set screws are not tight on the bearing. We'll remove that, make sure our mark that we just put is centered, and then we'll lock these 2 screws and the set screw on this collar in place. We'll do that and we'll be back. So we've made our alignment mark, which is what we have here. A mark on the steering lobe and a mark on the shaft to represent the center of the lobe when the steering wheel is straight. Let's go to the drawing and explain exactly what we're doing. Here's what we're doing. When the steering wheel is straight, we want the wings, the angles on that steering lobe piece, to be equal, so that when you turn the wheel to the left it will stop at a certain angle, and when you turn the wheel to the right, the handlebars to the right, it'll stop at the same angle on the other side. We're just trying to center it up. Same thing here in the other direction. We just want this steering lobe to be about centered between those bearings. So back up here, here's our little wing angles that you saw on the drawing, and there's the mark we just made. So now with the upper bearing off, we're going to go ahead and tighten these with our 3/16 Allen wrench, and also the set screw in the collar as well. Let's tighten those 3 things, reinstall our upper bearing, and then lock everything in place, and we'll come back. And we got all our hardware snugged down. So this is what we look like here. Recall we had our alignment there, we had the bearing off. We tightened these screws. You're going to want to tighten the set screw first on the collar, and then these two, and then you'll reinstall your bearing. And when you do that, pay attention to the orientation. You want the set screw down, just like it's shown here. And then you'll run all the hardware in snug, and you'll also want to square up the bearings with the bearing mounting angles here. And you can do that easily by just tapping them around a little bit with a rubber mallet until it's all squared up on the corners like that, and then lock everything in place. And now your steering stop lobe is going to serve as a stop in each direction, just like that. And this will keep you from twisting up your brake cable and your throttle cable if you let go of the handlebar in any situation. So instead of the wheels spinning all the way around and breaking your throttle cable and your brake cable, it'll stop. So with that, you are done with step 2. Let's move on now to step 3. Here's our clean work area for step 3 of drawing 300. We have our assembled trike up until this point. We have our handlebar assembly that you put together in drawing 304. We have our tools and our drawing. And here's sheet 3, which is step number 3. In this case, we're simply going to slide the handlebar assembly, drawing 304, down into the fork stem, the hollow fork shaft, if you will. This drawing, like all the others, has a bill of material in the lower right hand corner. In this case, just one item, the handlebar assembly that you put together, drawing 304. And of course the assembly notes. Let's take a look at the tools. We'll need a 5mm Allen key, a 6mm Allen key, and a Phillips screwdriver. So the handlebar assembly, drawing 304, will have a protective plastic cap on it, or may have one on it. I'm just going to go ahead and remove that, and then you can see there's a wedge here. Let me show that to you. This is a typical bike stem. This is nothing new. So as you tighten this screw at the top, this wedge will draw in and cinch this handlebar stem to the fork stem. So we're simply going to slip this right down inside the hollow opening of the fork tube that you just put into place there. Okay, and we're going to remember that the throttle goes on the right hand side and the brake on the left hand side. So I'm just going to slip this right down in there. Just like that. Now, eventually we're going to want to align this handlebar such that when the handlebar is even, the steering wheel is straight, obviously. And we'll also want to adjust it up and down. But for now, I'm simply going to take my 6mm screw and I'm going to snug this up so it stays in place. I'll do that and I'll be right back. So with our handlebar just snugged in the fork assembly opening here, we're going to move on and we're going to thread the throttle cable down through the center of the frame and out so that later we can hook it to the engine. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to loosen these two screws a little bit with the Phillips to allow it to rotate, so as we thread the cable down through there, it doesn't offer resistance, and then also so we can optimize that position. So what you're going to do is you're going to thread this end of the cable, the free end, the opposite end of this, down through this hole, through the center of the frame. I don't know if you can see down in there, but there's another hole right here that leads into this member. So you're going to feed it down through that way, all the way through the center of the tube. But you'll see there's another opening right back there, and I think it's in the dark, but there's another opening on this side of the frame only. And then your cable will come up here into about here and connect to your motor at a later step. Okay, so we threaded our throttle cable down through our frame. And again, we went down here, down through there, all the way back and out through this access hole here. Now your cable is going to be much longer than it needs to be, and of course we'll have to cut that off later. But this actually wasn't as bad as I thought. What I did is I just put a pre-bend in the end of the cable, and what that did is that when we got to this hole here, having the end of that cable like kind of already bent that way, with the stiffness of the cable we were just able to push it, and it just worked its way right all the way back. And then all we did is when we got the cable back to here somewhere, we just looked in the end with a flashlight and then just pulled the cable forward or back until the very end of the cable was accessible in this hole. And then I just reached right in there with my needle nose and pulled it right out. Actually wasn't that bad. Just wanted to jump back in here and talk about this throttle positioning a little bit more. Since it's going down into this hole, we want to make sure that there's no kinks. So you can see as I rotate that, it wants to kink a little bit. So let this thing go back and forth and find its happy spot, so to speak. And then you can lock these two Phillips screws down. Let's move on to the brake. To reassemble the brake cable, we're just going to do the reverse order of what we did with the bike disassembly. If you can refer back to that video if you'd like. First thing you're going to do is thread the end of the cable down through this hoop, and then recall these components which were in the end of here. So we're just going to I took those out, I just simply unscrewed them. So we're going to fish this back up through here just like that. Get that, sorry about the camera work there, trying to work one-handed, but so we got that, and then we're going to slip the spring over it as well. There we go, and just kind of push that up there. And then you're going to go back down through this hole right here, just like that, and then just re-thread that. Okay, and then on the underside of the brake here, just like you removed it, you're going to take your 5mm wrench and you're going to slip this cable right in here and under that fork. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll be back. You can also refer to your bicycle manual as well. And with your brake properly adjusted, it's time to move on to step 4.